I didn't believe in ghosts at all before, but now I do believe, and this is the story that made me a believer. I have never told this story to anyone, not even my closest friends. The thought of reliving the memories has always filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. But now, as I sit here alone, I feel compelled to finally share my experience. The town where I was born and raised was in the quiet and peaceful countryside. There were no notable places to play, and it was a shabby town, but there was one thing that was peculiar about it. On the outskirts of town, there was a vacant house that stood alone, overgrown with trees and shrubbery. It seemed like no one had lived there for a long time, and it was quite run down, giving off an exceptionally old feeling, even in this old-fashioned rural town. If that was all, it would just be an old empty house. But there are reasons I call it peculiar. For one, it was the excessive reaction of the adults in town to any discussion of it. Just trying to talk about the vacant house would get you scolded harshly. It was the same for all the children in town, including myself. Another thing was that, for some reason, there was no way to look inside. There were windows and glass doors, but they were all painted black, and none of them were broken. Those mysterious elements often piqued the interest of the children, and for a time, it became the #1 topic among us. Most of us kids, including myself, were trying to explore and find out what was there. But the fact that our parents would get so angry just for talking about it made it difficult. The location itself was easy for kids to get to, and there were no prying eyes. I think everyone had probably come right up to the front of the empty house, at least once. For a while, we enjoyed the atmosphere and spent our days without incident. A few months after I entered junior high school, a certain boy moved into the town and learned about the house. He became very interested and said he really wanted to see it. His name was Lewis. Lewis's mother was originally from this town and had married and moved to a big city. But after getting divorced, she returned to her parents' home, which was her grandmother's house. Since Lewis himself was new to this town, he didn't seem to know about the house's story at all. At that time, he and I got close through my curiosity about big city life. Whenever we were together, I'd ask questions about skyscrapers, restaurants, and shopping malls in the city. He, in turn, would ask me endlessly about the house on the outskirts of town. He didn't seem to have the apprehension to talk about the house that I and the other kids in town grew up with. I warned him that if my dad caught us talking about it, we would be in a lot of trouble, but nothing I said would discourage him. He'd often invite me to explore the house's surroundings with him. He would spend hours circling it, calling out to see if anyone would answer back through the black windows. As time went on, Lewis's fascination with the vacant house began to consume him. It seemed to be the only topic he was interested in discussing, much to the annoyance of his peers. Whenever he had the chance, he would corner one of the other kids and bombard them with questions about the house's history and any rumors surrounding it. He was always baffled at how little people knew. At first, the other children tried to be patient with Lewis, understanding that he was new to the town. But as his obsession grew, so did their frustration. They started to avoid him during breaks and lunch, not wanting to be subjected to another interrogation about the house. One day, a particularly irritated classmate finally snapped at Lewis. From what I could gather, the kid had told Lewis that his obsession was weird, and that he needed to stop asking about the house if he wanted to have any friends. The words were harsh, and I could see the hurt well up in Lewis's face. Despite this, Lewis didn't let up. He started spending more and more time there, wandering around the outskirts of town and staring at the black windows of the house, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of something inside. It was during one of these expeditions that Lewis made a startling decision. Armed with a rock he had found nearby, he approached one of the windows on the side of the house. With a wide swing, the glass shattered, creating an opening large enough for a person to climb through. Before I could fully process what was happening, Lewis had climbed through the opening, disappearing into the darkness of the house. I stood there in shock. After a brief moment, I heard Lewis's voice calling me over from inside the house. He was inviting me to join him in exploring the house's interior. I hesitated, remembering the warnings from my parents and the other adults in town. But seeing the excitement in Lewis's face, I couldn't say no. I climbed in after him as he cleared some of the broken glass away for me. As we entered the house, the first thing that struck me was the emptiness. The rooms were bare, without a single piece of furniture or decoration. It was as if the house had been completely cleared out, leaving only the walls and floors behind. Even more peculiar was the cleanliness of the space. For an abandoned house, there wasn't a single speck of dust or dirt to be found. It was almost as if someone had been meticulously maintaining the interior. Lewis and I moved cautiously while scanning the rooms with our small flashlights. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the hardwood floors. As we explored further, we noticed other oddities about the house. The walls were completely bare, without even a hint of wallpaper or paint. The windows, which had appeared black from the outside, were actually covered in a thick, dark film that made it impossible to see through. We made our way up the stairs to the second floor, our hearts pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The stairs creaked under our weight, echoing through the empty house. At the top of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long, narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. At the end of the hallway, we could see a single door, slightly ajar. As we approached the door, a strange feeling washed over me. It was as if the air had suddenly grown heavy, pressing down on us from all sides. Lewis felt it too, and we exchanged a nervous glance before pushing the door open. Inside the room, we found ourselves face to face with a large, standing mirror. It was the only object in the otherwise empty space, and it seemed to dominate the room with its presence. The mirror was ornate, with a gilded frame that seemed to glow in the dim light of our flashlights. But the surface of the mirror seemed to be covered in a dirty film. I continued panning my flashlight around and noticed the walls here too were bare, besides the presence of a singular black window. As I looked around for anything else, I noticed that Lewis's flashlight had been fixed on one thing the entire time. When I turned to look, he appeared to be staring deeply into the mirror. I asked him what he was looking at, but he just continued to stare without answering. When I turned my light from him to the mirror, I noticed, through the thick black film on the mirror's surface, a figure with long black hair crawling toward us through the door we had left open behind us. I tried to run, but my body refused to listen. I was frozen. My heart pounded, and I tried to scream, but only the sound of the figure's labored movements filled the room. As the figure approached, its movements broken and terrifying, it suddenly vanished from the mirror's reflection. For a brief moment, I thought perhaps it had been a trick of the light. But then, a guttural noise sounded from Lewis's feet, and I saw the figure there, its face obscured by a curtain of dark hair. Lewis's face began to contort in pain, causing his mouth to open unnaturally wide. Suddenly, the same guttural sound began to emanate from Lewis's mouth. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held me captive, and I regained control of my body. Without a second thought, I ran towards the blackened window and threw myself through it, shards of glass cutting into my skin as I tumbled to the ground below. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of the ghastly figure fading into the darkness of that room. Lewis and I were discovered hours later. We were found unconscious some feet away from the house. My parents later told me that I had lost all memory of the events of that night, but for weeks afterwards, I would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. I took to breaking every mirror in our house, unable to bear the sight of my own reflection. Even the smallest glimpse of a reflective surface would send me into a panic. It was months before I was able to return to school, my mind still reeling from trauma. When I finally did go back, I learned that Lewis had been absent as well. His mother had decided they should move back to the city, desperately searching for a way to help her son, who had been trapped in a similar state. As I walked through the school grounds, I caught a glimpse of Lewis sitting in his mother's car, waiting for her to collect his things. He seemed expressionless, his face a blank mask. But for one brief moment, as if sensing my gaze, he turned his head slowly to meet my eyes. And there, in his eyes, was a hollowness that chilled me to the core. I began to tremble as I felt the memories of that night flooding back in. When I looked back up, Lewis was gone. Many years have passed since that night, but the scars it left on me have never healed. Each night, as I try to drift off to sleep, I can hear the sound of that figure's relentless approach. Its eerie scraping and dragging growing louder with each passing moment. I clench my eyes shut, silently praying that if I look down, it won't be Lewis's tormented face staring back at me. His mouth open in a haunting, silent scream.